Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're looking into what's literally the most fascinating tech merger of the entire year. We're talking about a deal that absolutely shakes up the software world, but also kind of completely shatters how we think about competition and antitrust in the age of AI. Yep, we're diving into the massive, dramatic acquisition agreement between SpaceX and Cursor.
To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale here, we gotta look at Cursor. They're the absolute dominant player in AI native developer interfaces, or IDEs. Seriously, 67% of the Fortune 500 use their solutions. That's practically everyone. By April of 2026, they were already raking in around $3 billion in annual revenue. And their end-of-year projections? A staggering $6 billion. Not too shabby for a company most folks outside the coding world hadn't even heard of a couple of years ago, right? They are totally dominating the market. Okay, let's dive into this. Because despite this insane, undeniable success, Cursor is actually trapped. They've got this fatal structural flaw built right into their business model. It's a crazy paradox where literally the faster they grow, the closer they get to putting themselves right out of business. Section 1. Mapping the AI developer stack. Upstream models versus downstream interfaces. So to really grasp this trap, we first need to map out how the AI coding market actually works. Think of it like a two-layer system, totally separating the brains from the interface. Up at the top, you've got the upstream foundation models. These are the massive, heavy-hitting AI systems, like Anthropic's Claude or OpenAI's GPT. They're the ones actually generating the code and the intelligent suggestions. Down at the bottom, you have the downstream interfaces, like Cursor, which package that raw intelligence into something developers can actually use. Now, Cursor completely leads this downstream layer. But here's the catch, and it's a huge vulnerability. Cursor doesn't actually build its own foundation models. It relies 100% on those upstream giants, OpenAI and Anthropic, for its foundational intelligence. Section 2. The inverted data siphon. How AI flipped the platform script.
That total reliance sets the stage for a massive paradigm shift in how data actually flows in the modern AI economy. Let's think about traditional platforms for a second, like Amazon Marketplace. If you've ever bought an Amazon Basics charging cable instead of a name brand one, you know exactly how this works. Digital antitrust experts know it too. Amazon sits at the top, they watch what independent third-party sellers are doing down below, and they basically extract that data downward to build their own competing products. But AI? AI has completely flipped the script. It's totally inverted. In the AI world, Cursor owns the downstream interface and the customer relationship. But because they have to use those upstream foundational APIs, the flow of data goes upward. Think about what that actually means. Every single time a software engineer at one of those Fortune 500 companies uses Cursor, highly valuable data is sent straight up the chain. We're talking metadata, multi-file context arrangements, prompt refinement patterns, exactly what code developers accept or reject, all of it fed directly into the upstream API providers, OpenAI and Anthropic. The integrated upstream giants are literally siphoning data upward right out of the dominant downstream innovator. And this creates what we're calling the subsidy paradox. It's basically a trap with two vicious layers. First, you've got the capital subsidy. Cursor pays massive API inference fees, literally funding the billions of dollars OpenAI and Anthropic need to train their next generation models. Second, and honestly even more critical, is the data subsidy. Cursor is acting like a giant self-funding R&D lab for its own suppliers, which is basically the corporate equivalent of paying for the shovels to dig your own grave. OpenAI and Anthropic ingest Cursor's perfectly refined training data to sharpen their own native downstream coding tools, like GitHub Copilot and Claude Code, which then turn around and compete directly with Cursor. Cursor's immense success is actively accelerating the tech of its biggest rivals. Section 3. SpaceX's rescue mission, merging to break the dependency loop. So, how on earth do you escape a trap where your own suppliers are using your money and your data to replace you? Well, you find an independent upstream supplier. Enter SpaceX. Back in April 2026, a dramatic, wild solution emerged, an option agreement for SpaceX to just acquire Cursor outright. Now, remember, SpaceX had previously acquired xAI, the team behind the Grok Foundation model. So, by merging Cursor's dominant downstream interface with Grok's emerging upstream model, the combined company can finally redirect those flows. Cursor gets to keep all its enterprise telemetry and its cache inside its own ecosystem, optimizing Grok instead of feeding the flywheels of its direct competitors. It sounds like the absolute perfect strategic escape plan, right? Well,
Hold on a second. Because of the massive scale of this transaction, it instantly triggers a formal review under the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act. And man, this is where things get really complicated. Section 4. Why regulators get it wrong. The failure of legacy antitrust frameworks. Here's the big issue. Applying old legacy regulatory rules to this dynamic, flipped upside-down AI stock just creates a massive illusion. Regulators instinctively want to look at a deal like this through the lens of old-school vertical relationships. The traditional rulebook is built around this concept of vertical foreclosure. Basically, this is the theory that a massive, dominant upstream supplier buys a downstream company just to choke off competitors, cutting them off from essential inputs or artificially jacking up their costs. Think of those old static markets, where money was just exchanged for a fixed distribution rate. And this brilliantly illustrates why that traditional framework totally fails to match the market reality of AI. Look, SpaceX and xAI do not possess upstream monopoly power. Not even close. Grok is an emerging challenger trying to fight its way into a market totally led by Anthropic and OpenAI. The company doing the acquiring here is actually structurally weak in the upstream tier, and they're linking up with a strong player downstream. It is the exact, literal opposite of standard vertical foreclosure. If authorities stick to the old rules and block this transaction, they aren't protecting competition at all. They would effectively be locking Cursor right back into a cycle of structural dependency. Blocking the deal legally forces an independent innovator to just keep financing and training its dominant integrated rivals. The real competitive threat here wasn't SpaceX foreclosing the market. It was the immense holdup power and data leverage that those integrated incumbents already held over Cursor. Section 5. A pro-competitive future. The inefficiencies of defensive vertical integration. When we actually look at this as a defensive vertical integration, we can clearly see how this merger is a huge win for the broader market and honestly for the developers writing the code. There are 3 distinct, massively pro-competitive efficiencies here. First, cost reduction. The new entity totally eliminates external API markups, which means better pricing or way higher prompt allocations for the users. Second, performance optimization. They can actually co-engineer the foundation model natively right along with the IDE. We're talking optimizing context windows specifically for massive code bases and slashing execution times. And third, and maybe the most important, the removal of innovation barriers. Cursor can finally invest heavily in totally new user experiences without the terrifying fear that those innovations will just be instantly absorbed and copied by its suppliers' core models. So the crucial point is that post-merger, we see the creation of a beautifully integrated, highly efficient closed loop. The SpaceX Cursor entity completely resolves that holdup problem. By redirecting its usage data and its capital back into its own independent foundation model, it secures its supply chain, completely eliminates the competitor subsidy, and creates a much stronger, unified challenger in the entire AI market stack. Which leaves us with a really critical question moving forward. This merger absolutely proves that traditional vertical merger models, rules built for static, physical supply chains, are seriously struggling to keep up with the inverted, dynamic realities of artificial intelligence. So, will future antitrust frameworks actually evolve to recognize the difference between anti-competitive foreclosure and pro-competitive integration? Or will they inadvertently trap our true innovators into continually funding their own replacements? It's a massive question and one that's going to define the next decade of technology. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Thanks for watching. For the deep dive economic analysis behind these stories, join us at EconWorks.com. Subscribe to stay informed on where law and economics meet the market. We'll see you in the next episode.